I am a human being and I killed human beings.
Before I knew it, I'd fired 4 shots at the door. I kept on shouting for Eva to phone the police.
Tests are underway to determine if a serial killer is on the loose in Centurion, Pretoria.
The dead won't bother you. It's the living you got to worry about.
Hello, everybody. It's Tuesday night, and we're back in our usual time slots. Tuesday 8 p.m. Is where we do the live. There's Gerard. Hi, Gerard. Welcome to Profiler Africa. I'm Paul Llewellyn. Tonight, we are unpacking the tragic murder of Jacques du Plessis. We'll explore the volatile relationship that led to Jacques' death, his wife Mariska's defense claims, and the broader issue of domestic violence in South Africa. As always, I'm joined by Gerard Labuschagne. He is from 2001 to 2016. Gerard led the investigative psychology section of the South African Police Service, and he is, of course, our profiler. Good evening, Gerard.
Hey, Paul, and hi to all the viewers.
How's it going? You need to grab a glass of water, I think, eh?
Yeah, got one here, off camera.
All right, cool. Before we get into tonight's episode, please subscribe to Profiler Africa for more gripping true crime stories. Join our Patreon community at patreon.com/Profiler Africa to support the show and access exclusive content. If you send a super like, we'll give you a shout out in the next episode. It's a great way to support the show and what we do. So please hit us up with a super like if you feel so inclined. And don't forget to join the live chat. Hopefully we'll have a bunch of people jumping on, and we'll be fielding your questions throughout the episode. Share whatever questions you have about tonight's case or anything else, and we'll tackle them in the last 10 minutes of the show, as always. Now, let's dive straight into tonight's case. This is a case we've discussed before, Gerard, but I think we'll be saying this a few times in the future, where it's now that we've got video on our side. Video has unkilled the radio star, or video has killed the radio star. It's nice to be able to show folks some of the case material, some of the clips that we have, etc. So, just adds extra depth to the discussion. So we're going over the case of Mariska du Plessis and the murder of Jacques du Plessis, her husband. But let's start by contextualizing gender-based violence in South Africa, Gerard. In your experience, what have you generally encountered when it comes to violence between men and women?
Yeah, so obviously the work I was doing back in the days in the police, we only worked on serious violent crimes. And that's not to dismiss gender-based violence that doesn't lead to a lethal level. It's just the stuff we tended to be involved in were the intimate partner murders, maybe here and there, stalking cases, etc. So, really, in real life, it's that spans anything from the control financially, emotionally, physically, psychologically over the person and their movements and their behavior. And of course, the worst case scenario then ends up, of course, being your intimate partner murders. But usually that's man on woman. Obviously, tonight's episode is one of those ones that are very out of the ordinary. It's a female killing their male partner. And what's even more unique is that the person was directly involved, was the sole perpetrator, where often we would see in domestic violence, intimate partner murders, where it's woman killing man, they often involve other parties, the new lover or a hired hand who's supposed to help them with it. So, this is quite unique in that it was her by herself, and also that she used a shotgun to do it. So from my experiences, it was quite a unique case. And obviously I got involved in this when I'd left the police already. I think this was 2019 when I got the phone call from the prosecutor asking me to assist, and was already at trial. So I didn't play a role in the investigation. I was out the police, but this was purely getting my involvement later on for court purposes.
Okay. So just elaborate a little bit on that. How would you get involved in something like this post your involvement? Who would reach out to you, for example?
So that would typically, if you're at trial or going to trial, it's really then going to be the hands of the prosecutor to decide if they want to get an expert involved. So in this particular case, the state had led its evidence. It wasn't a whodunit when it got to trial. She was not denying it was her. She just, as I said, came with a defense, which we'll get into in a moment. And really, I got involved only because when it was this turn for the defense to call any witnesses, they called the therapist who had been treating her, and he came in court to give evidence and kind of overstepped a few boundaries, which I'm sure we'll get into a bit later on. And the prosecutor felt, I need to challenge this evidence. A prosecutor can only do so much to discredit an expert witness or a professional. Because I wouldn't regard this person as an expert witness in this case. He was a therapist coming to testify. But it's very difficult to challenge that. They might know this is absolute nonsense, but how do they effectively bring that across through their cross-examination? So there's often that difficulty. So definitely she felt, I need to bring someone to give a counter opinion or to comment on some things, and I know I'm going to now need to source an expert. Now, I had worked with this particular prosecutor, Cornelia Harms, and I mean, as most recently as last year on the Zondo case, with Bishop Zondo, who's on trial for multiple rapes of parishioners. I'd worked on it before that when I was in the police on certain cases. So a highly competent, one of the most senior advocates at the Pretoria Director of Public Prosecutions.
Okay. All right. So what we're going to be able to get from you then is a really great insight into what went down at the court case, and we'll really delve into some of these some of the important aspects of this case. I mean, a lot of psychology stuff, a lot of kind of your stuff that's in your ballpark: battered woman syndrome, intimate partner violence. I mean, she, from what I understand, Mariska had issues throughout her life. She was eating disorder as a young lady. Tell us a little bit about. Tell us a little bit about Mariska and Jacques. Just who were they?
Yeah, so she had a difficult sort of teenage years. I mean, I think we must just acknowledge that. It didn't sound like a very stable home life. She had some emotional challenges quite early on. I can't recall off the top of my head if she finished high school. But, very soon after leaving the school, she was already involved with an older person in a same-sex relationship. So I think just someone had a really difficult beginning. I think Jacques' beginning was perhaps a bit more stable. Jacques eventually went on to become a paramedic in the South African Defence Force in 1994. He was there until, I think, 2004. He was there for about 10 years. Left after some, obviously, paramedics see horrific things. And I think some of that stuff got to him. I think his wife had also passed away in a car accident. He was the driver thereof. So also had his own challenges and difficulties. Kind of left the military and then sort of started selling pools. And I think he was selling pools and pool repair equipment at the time when he met Mariska through, if I recall correctly, his sister, I think, worked at the same company that Mariska was working at, a pharmaceutical company in Centurion, Midrand. And I think they were all living in Centurion at the time. And I think the sister introduced him to Mariska. And it wasn't really initially hot off the press relationship straight away. I think he was kind of like maybe a bit uncertain. I think she was more kind of keen on the relationship and kind of was more pushing things to get to the status of a relationship. And yeah, so that's kind of how they met. It did appear to be a generally kind of stormy relationship. So it was one that had its ups and downs, and definitely later on, there was domestic violence issues on both sides. I mean, she was not a wallflower. She would give, perhaps even some people would say that I interviewed, that she was more of an aggressive person when it came to sort of domestic violence issues than Jacques was.
Yeah, absolutely. And if what we'll be doing, so that folks are aware, is that we will be playing an episode of True Crime Room this week as well. Where Derek discusses this case, and we have a number of folks, relatives, who knew Mariska and Jacques, and they give some really nice insights into the two of them and some of the difficulties that they experienced as a couple, kind of in the as their relationship started to kind of go through the motions, I guess. So let's then jump forward to, is there anything else that we need to talk about before we talk about the actual event itself on that evening? Obviously, there was a son involved. There was a son. Now, is that their son together?
Yeah. So I can't remember exactly when, but it was definitely before 2015. They were married. They had a young son, and we're not going to mention his name. And they relocated from Centurion to Henley-on-Klip, which is, many of you might have heard of that, because that's where Oprah Winfrey's fancy school is. And I always thought it was quite a nice area. And I think I was less impressed when I actually saw it, and maybe I just didn't see enough of it. But I always thought it was quite a very, very lawny area, and it was kind of like a nice average area, sort of in the Vol kind of direction. So they went there because I think Jacques got a job on a mine as a health and safety officer. Okay. And after a while that job ended, but they sort of stayed there. And Mariska was traveling all the way to Centurion every day, which is quite far from that side of the world, to her work literally in Midrand. Actually, sorry, Midrand was where her company was. Okay. I can't recall specifically what she did there, but I think she was actually quite well paid. And I think by the time the murder occurred, Jacques was kind of more doing odd jobs here and there, anything from installing cameras, CCTV cameras, to odds, bits and pieces. He didn't really have a fixed income. So she was definitely financially the bigger breadwinner, and kind of was literally in control of the purse strings, so to speak. And that becomes very relevant later on when the issue of battered woman syndrome is raised.
Yeah, and we'll actually take a look at some of the clips as well from the CCTV from that evening. And just for folks who are tuning in, it is a little bit sensitive, so we just want to put that disclaimer up front. We did put a disclaimer at the front of the show that, just be prepared for just a little bit of insight into what was going on in their house on the night of the incident. So what happened on the night of the incident, Gerard? I mean, what started this thing off? What set them off? I mean, we understand they had a volatile... Sorry. Yeah,
it was the 23rd of June, 2017. So already it's about almost 8 years old, 7.5 years old, this case. And they were at home, I think it was a Friday night or Saturday night, braaiing by themselves. It was Mariska, Jacques, and their son. And kind of what triggered this whole thing off was that the son had put some headphones into a glass of water and, obviously damaged them. And Jacques, the dad, got quite upset with this and either did or wanted to give their son a hiding. And the moms kind of got upset about this, etc. And that sparked off this argument that probably lasted, fighting, bitching back and forth, probably about an hour or maybe even more on that evening. You have to remember, there was also a fair amount of alcohol, going through their lips that evening. And things kind of escalated, fizzled off. Then it's kind of pushy, shovey, F you, get out the house, bugger you, no. And you'll see some of the footage now. There is some pushing and shoving. I've seen the whole spectrum of the CCTV footage, and in my personal opinion, for what it's worth, you kind of almost see Jacques as, how can I put it, like not the natural abuser. He doesn't seem comfortable using violence. You'll see kind of when he pushes her, it's kind of almost tentative, etc. Where she definitely, I think, was, as I said, not a wallflower. She was not someone who would keep quiet about anything she was unhappy about, and we would be incredibly vocal, swearing and carrying on, etc. But so that seems to be pushing and shoving, centering around that issue that the son had been disciplined. And this kind of gets to the point where it's, I think, about 11:30 that night, where she makes a phone call to 10-111, and this was part of the police docket, saying, my husband's been aggressive towards me and our son, please help. And I think it's about 10 minutes later, the shooting had obviously happened, and she phones and says, help, someone, essentially like someone came into the house and shot my husband. And that was kind of the story that the police receive when they arrive, is that her and the son were in the main bedroom, and they heard the husband Jacques shout from the house, close the door, in Afrikaans, sluit die deur of maak die deur toe. And then they did that, and they were waiting in the bedroom, and then they heard a shot, and she came out and then saw Jacques lying in front of his computer, having been shot, and then called the police. So that's kind of what the police arrived to, is what appeared to be really a home invasion. and on the surface of it, not something that was uncommon or unheard of. She's sort of mixture of being quite distraught. Some people said she was very calm. She calls the neighbor come over. The neighbors were quite good friends of theirs and sort of came over to assist and take her out the house in the sun and get some clothes. And the police obviously arrive. But I guess what was weighing on the back of her mind was, as you'll see, there's a couple CCTV cameras inside the house. Now, Jacques had kind of been very paranoid about crime in the area, which is why partly he installed the cameras inside the house. And she obviously realized, specifically because Jacques' brother arrived early in the hours of the morning after the shooting by the request of the police, because I think he helped install the cameras. So Jacques' brother was going to take the hard drive and then go and download the contents. So Mariska knew, well, obviously, if they're going to listen to that contents, they're going to know there was some shouting and fighting and arguing. And of course, as you'll hear the listeners now, a huge bang and then screams, shock, shock, shock. So she knew the clock was ticking, that her version of events wasn't going to be going down. When I later interviewed her, she said that already that night, I think her parents lived not too far away, or her mother or father. And when she was sitting in the car outside the house while the police were inside, she allegedly already told her father, look, it was me. And it kind of like by, I think, the Monday thereafter or the Tuesday, maybe even the Sunday, I can't recall the exact dates, she then, got a lawyer, and then the lawyer contacted the police and kind of said, look, my client wants to say something, and kind of essentially hand herself over.
Okie dokie. So, we're going to jump into some of the clips in a sec. Let's just say hi to everyone on the chat. Thanks for joining us on the live chat. If you have any questions related to the case for Gerard, please do let us know. Hi to Marius again, to Henry. Helen, as usual, lovely to have Helen with us. Naleen, hi from Joburg. We've got Louis in Auckland. And we're not the only one. Anyway, all right. So, hi guys. Drop us any questions if you'd like. So let's look at the first clip then. So, like you say, I mean, these guys also had they like to party. They liked their drink. And alcohol seemed to play its role in these incidents as well. Let's have a look at the first clip then.
So this is inside, obviously, their kitchen. Remember, this is like about an hour and a half of pushy, shovey, shouty going on here.
Yeah.
I think that might have just been her slipping.
A little bit drunk. Yeah, exactly. So there's stuff going down, and then the arguing starts.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so that gives you a sense of then of what was going on inside the house. Yeah. Shall we jump there? I mean, it pretty much escalates from there. I mean, it seems to be, anyone who's, anyone who's been in a similar kind of situation where you're in a conflict situation, you'll know how easily things can escalate and often how difficult it can be to deflate a situation, isn't it?
And I mean, once there's alcohol involved, alcohol is really the scourge of our planet. It is involved in so many violent crimes and accidental injuries with vehicles. It's just really never helpful. So that's just a bad mix for anything when people are fighting and arguing, sadly.
Okay, and so let's look at the next clip. So this is essentially the argument escalating.
Yeah, so she's trying to get him out the house. That's the gate leading to the outside.
And let's watch the clip. Gerard, the one thing I've noticed is that, it's very much like she does a lot of talking about him being unemployed, being useless.
Yeah.
So it's not just the physical kind of conflict that's going on here. A lot of kind of verbal really just trying to get under each other's skin. And that seemed to be something that she would like you've said, she kind of gave as good as she got in that department, for sure.
Yeah. And that's something that, the friends that would visit with them and the neighbors specifically said, like, she would often, as soon as she started drinking, if they were having a braai, she would have a go at him about, you're effing useless, you don't bring the money in, etc. And the kind of friends would say that he would never really react to that. He would always just say, oh, my wife works so hard, kind of like making excuses for her, for her sort of her behavior and the things that she was saying towards him.
Yeah. Deanne has asked, were they not aware the cameras were installed? And I mean, we touched on that, is that, one thing that is kind of clear about this, about what happened in the immediate aftermath, is that, like you say, she knew that what was contained on those cameras, and her story changed a number of times in the immediate aftermath of the event.
So I think Jacques actually installed the cameras, so she knew they were there. But I think in that moment, you're not thinking this is ever going to be something that anybody else is going to watch, because I don't think she planned to kill him. I've never ever felt that this was a premeditated murder. I think it kind of, and I said in my report, if they hadn't had this argument that evening, I don't think we would have had the shooting. So I mean, at that point, you're not thinking this is probably one of many fights they've had, and you're not thinking that this is going to end up in a courtroom because someone's dead or because one person physically assaulted the other and now there's a case. Yeah. So you don't think about that in those moments. And as I said, I don't think she planned that this was going to, I don't think she knew that within the next 10 minutes, she's going to pick up a gun and shoot him. Yeah,
absolutely. Pierre has said that it seems like the dogs are quite used to the arguments. I mean, you must note that, there's the dog there, but then also the fact that their son is in the house. I mean, we mustn't forget that fact, that he's actually there while this is all unfolding.
Yeah, that poor kid, if I recall correctly, he must have been 12, 13, if I'm talking under correction. So, I mean, just to hear these fights, obviously, and obviously the bang that he's going to hear, I mean, I can't just fathom what this kid has gone through since then, and even before then with, these types of arguments.
Yeah. But often you'd see that a pet would kind of get involved, wouldn't the dog? The dog just seems very happy to just kind of, it seems like fairly commonplace in the household.
Yeah, certainly.
All right, we're going to jump on to the actual shooting now. So we'll play the actual, so you'll hear, you won't see anything graphic, obviously, but you will hear the audio of the gunshot and then Mariska immediately afterwards. So again, just a warning to sensitive viewers.
Yeah.
I mean, it must be, I mean, when you've done that, I mean, and then, because obviously she knows what she's done, and then there's that reaction, screaming, Jacques, Jacques. I mean, almost in that sense of shock and surprise. I mean, you have conflicts on a fairly regular basis, and then it escalates to this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
what kind of happened? Yeah. So what happened? Because I mean, as I said, I had the opportunity to do a lengthy interview with her. I think over 2 or 3 sessions, and then I actually took her back to that very same house. She was still living there, to do a walkthrough. Like I said, literally walk me through that evening and what happened up until the actual shooting and a few minutes thereafter. So literally, I had this on film. Unfortunately, I can't necessarily show you guys, and she took me through the process. And she said that she took her son, I think who was in his room, if I remember correctly, put the son in her room and said, stay here until I come and get you. And then she lifted up the mattress where this unlicensed shotgun was, a single barrel shotgun. And she then cocked it and then walked down the passage. And Jacques was essentially standing by his computer at the end of the passage. He often would make sort of mixed music on his computer. And as she kind of gets to the end of the passage, as you kind of heard, she then pulls the trigger and literally shoots him in the back of the head with a shotgun. So you see that this picture on the left-hand side, the top right-hand side is the door passage, the passage of the door to going to the passage, and the other one is the door going to the kitchen. So where Jacques, you see his leg, he's on the other side of this fallen over chair. It's literally where he was standing, kind of with his back towards her, because as I said, the shot was kind of at the back. And she kind of fired it when she got to that doorway on the right-hand side. You can see a bit of a red, I think it's a bit of a red something on the table there. And then essentially went back into the room, hid the shotgun, and then essentially called the cops. So what you're seeing there is later on when she's doing the pointing out afterwards, this is probably 2 or 3 days later, pointing out where she got the shotgun. It was underneath that mattress.
Okay, we'll get to that then. We'll bring that image back up in a moment. Okay, talk us then exactly through what her story was once again. Just remind us what her story was in the immediate aftermath.
Yeah.
And then we get to the fact that we kind of know it was her. So just walk us through that again. And then right up to this point where she actually gets to, where she does do the pointing out. Yeah. And explain what a pointing out is again, just for those who might be new viewers.
Okay, so as you recall, on the night in question, the second phone call to 10111 is somebody shot my husband, words to that effect, not her. And the cops come out and she portrays the story of this having been home invasion. She was in the bedroom with her son. She just heard Jacques scream to her, lock the bedroom door or lock the door. And then she just heard the shot, and then she came out and found him dead. So it was portrayed as a home invasion, which, as I said, sadly in South Africa is not uncommon. And but knowing that the game is going to be up pretty soon because there's this CCTV footage. Now, if there hadn't been that footage, the cops obviously didn't find that shotgun. They didn't search the whole house because they're thinking that this is a home invasion. And that's one of the things we often would say to detectives. Be careful about open and shut cases and just taking it at face value that this is a home invasion or a suicide, because you're going to treat this crime scene just as that. So they weren't going to look under the bed in the bath, or get a firearms dog, or et cetera, et cetera. So, if that footage hadn't been there, there's a damn good chance she would have probably got away with this. They might have suspected her at some point, but she would have gotten away with this if it wasn't but for that CCTV footage. And as I said, because the brother of Jacques came out that night and took the hard drives, I mean, she couldn't even go and destroy the hard drives in some fashion. Now, of course, they would have been suspicious, but what evidence do you have against her? So, of course, like I said, I think that night she tells her father in the car, it was me, this is what happened. And they get a lawyer, and I think the next day or the day after, they contact the police. And I think she was then pretty much arrested immediately. And then she was given bail, because I remember when I assessed her, and this was during the trial, she was out on bail, still staying at that very same house, I must add. And quite frankly, all she'd done is cleaned off the blood and brains on the wall. And when she'd hung a big picture over that point where the shotgun pellets had hit the wall. And when she took it off, I mean, all the little pellets were still there, and the holes. It's not like she had patched it up. It was quite bizarre. And still obviously living in this house with her son where this murder occurred. She had been dismissed from her work because obviously she worked with Jacques' sister, and they kind of said, well, we can't really have you working here. And they did give her a payout, quite a big payout, I think, to basically leave. And I think the first two things she did with that payout is get a boob job and braces.
Okay.
Now, you would think, if you're possibly going to go to jail, this payout might be the last money you have, and it better last you. Yeah. But I guess she had other priorities. So obviously the police then, she's coming forward with her lawyers. And because she came forward and the lawyers sort of came with her, the chances are pretty good you're going to probably get bail because you came forward with yourself, that the police didn't investigate and lead to you and arrest you. So she did agree to the pointing out. The pointing out is a process that I found unique to South Africa. It's a formal process where you have to get another officer who has no knowledge of the case. In other words, a lieutenant, captain, a commissioned officer, who then gets called in, meets with her and says, I believe you want to do a pointing out. I don't know anything about this case. And she says, yes. And he goes through a whole bunch of legal questions. Were you threatened? Were you promised anything, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And then, right, what do you want to show me? And then she would say, well, let's get into the police vehicle and I'll take you to this location and that location. And all of that is documented. So it's kind of like a confession with actions of pointing out various locations where you met the victim, where you disposed of an exhibit. And of course, if those match what the police know, or you find an exhibit when they point it out, that's phenomenally great evidence. So here, this is one of the photographs from the pointing out, where she's obviously pointing out where the firearm was. I don't know if she'd probably already told the cops. The cops would have gone there and seized the firearm, and she would just now be pointing it out. But if she hadn't told the cops where the firearm was, then she could potentially be pointing out the actual firearm during that process of the pointing out. So it's really better than a confession because it involves actions of showing various things that only the suspect would have knowledge of.
Do pointing outs happen anywhere else? Are you aware of any other countries that do them?
You do get, situations where the cops will get the suspect to do a walkthrough, but it's not as formal and with the sort of controls that ours has. So that very often that might be with the actual detective. Yeah. So the whole point of getting an independent and an officer is this kind of independence. The guy doesn't know about the case. He doesn't know the story, the ins and the outs. He's not supposed to have any knowledge. And if it's found that he did have knowledge prior to him doing the pointing out, that would probably render the pointing out inadmissible in court. So you really do want to get someone who wasn't on the crime scene, a photographer, police photographer who wasn't the police photographer at the crime scene, that they to sort of dispel this thing that they were taking the person to the place where the body was found. This person, the pointing out officer wrote down things because he knew them from his prior knowledge of the case. So you kind of get it, but not as formal. And this is the whole point of a pointing out, is that it's intended to be used in court as evidence, specifically when the person changes their mind and decides not to actually plead guilty. Well, then you would use the pointing out, and usually they would challenge it, saying I was threatened, it's not truthful, and you'd have a little trial within a trial about is it admissible. But if the person's got to plead guilty, they would draw up a guilty plea, and you wouldn't have to use a confession or a pointing out.
This is why it seems like, often if you watch other, international true crime programs or what have you, it's often the case that in the heat of the moment, in the chaos, obviously the person that's committed the act is a bit all over the place. The adrenaline's rushing, the story's changing. Where there's an admission early on, and there's a willingness early on it seems like this kind of evidence really is difficult to talk your way out of once you've done it,
If it's done properly, yeah. I mean, as I said, because you've got the independence of the officer who's doing it. They have to sign, you ask all these questions and they have to sign each page. Yes and no. And some pointing out officers will go so far as before they start to get the person to get undressed into their underwear and take pictures to show that there's no injuries or scratch marks. In the Western Cape, they would even take the potential confessor or pointing outer to the district surgeon for them to do a J88 medical examination of this person before and after, to show that if the guy alleges, but you guys tortured me, you assaulted me, there's no proof of that. So, you build in those mechanisms. It's a very robust process if it's done properly. Of course, the pointing out officer might make mistakes. He might not have things signed, and that can also render it inadmissible on a kind of like a procedural thing. But if it's done properly and people don't cut corners, it's a phenomenally watertight piece of evidence, and people have gone to jail just on a properly done pointing out.
Yeah, seems like it should. It's one of those things that could be adopted elsewhere because it seems like a really good thing. We're going to take a little segue just to do a little bit of admin, and then we'll come back and we'll continue to look at the crime scene photos. We'll look at the actual weapon, and we'll have a little bit of a discussion about that as well. And then we'll get into the court case after that. Guys, if you're tuning in for the first time, please do hit the like button, subscribe. The more that you support the channel, the more content we can bring you. This episode of Profiler Africa is brought to you by plotshift.co.za, your trusted partner for TV and commercial content production. Whether it's compelling storytelling or high-quality visuals, Plotshift is the team to make it happen. Visit us today, and we're here to help with all your TV and video needs. hit like and subscribe. Welcome to everyone on the live chat. It's lovely to have you with us. DN, wait, who was it that was mentioning here? Let me see. DN, it was DN who was asking Helen if she's involved in the show and why. I can promise you, DN, Helen's just a big fan, and she's with us every Tuesday. Yeah, but there are definitely ways to get involved in helping us to put the show together if you want. So drop us an email, profilerafricainfo@gmail.com. Questions, comments, feedback. Or if you have any ideas to throw our way, please do feel free to reach out to us. All right, let's go back to some of the crime scene photographs. So we were at the point of the pointing out, and then let's have a look at what she was pointing out.
Yeah, so
okay, so we have the weapon.
So you can see it's broken after the shot was fired. It was really a single barrel, obviously single shot shotgun that had essentially a pistol grip. And that's what you're seeing there. And that broken pieces, I think, were the grip itself, which kind of came apart after the shot was fired. Where they got it from is a big mystery. Nobody knows, but it was not licensed to Jacques or Mariska. And that, of course, led to one of the charges against her being possession of an unlicensed firearm, unlicensed ammunition. And that on its own can bring you up to 15 years imprisonment just for that.
Well, hold that thought, because when you get to the sentence, it'll be interesting to go back to that comment. So here's just a closer shot of the gun. I mean, it's a bit of a relic by the looks of it.
Yeah, look, you're putting your life in your own hands when you fire that thing. And as you saw, it kind of basically fell apart at the first shot. I
mean, Gerard, I know that you are a weapons enthusiast. Anything, any further kind of comment on just on the gun itself, and I guess in crimes in South Africa, you see just a whole array of different weapons.
Yeah. Yeah, well, look, obviously that's the total piece of crap. If you want something for self-defense, go to the efforts and time to get your firearms competency certificate, purchase that firearm, go for shooting some lessons and practice every now and then, and keep it, of course, in accordance with the law and how you store it, because keeping it under the bed, besides the fact it's a lethal firearm, you're not allowed to keep your firearm in, basically the law in South Africa is, if it's not in your safe, which is bolted to the wall, it must be a firearm safe. It has to be either directly on your body or under your direct control. Leaving it in a bedside drawer, if you're not in the house, you're going to get yourself into trouble. And of course, definitely if a child finds it and injures themselves or somebody else, you're going to go to jail probably for negligent handling of your own firearm. So it is possible in South Africa. Just make sure that you go through the necessary legal steps. It's not a fast process. So if you are even toying with the idea of wanting to own a firearm, do your firearms competency now. That's kind of like a driver's license. Doesn't mean you're going to buy a car. But when you want to buy a car, you're ready to drive. Same kind of principle. Your competency certificate, which can, is a test you write. You have to go shoot a couple shots as part of that process, and you get issued that. And from then can you then actually apply for a firearms license. So it's not a fast process. So if it's even on your radar, just do the competency that when you want to purchase, you're ready to go. You don't have to first go through the whole competency process, which sometimes you can wait 6 months, a year for that competency card. And you can't buy a firearm until you've got that little card.
Yeah, relatively speaking, we have a pretty good kind of gun control policies in South Africa. I guess the problem is that there's a lot of illegal weapons as well, isn't it?
Yeah, sadly, yeah. This was one of them, Yeah,
it's also the matter of the fact that a shotgun, the difference between what a shotgun will do to a body and what a rifle or a pistol will do. We're going to look now at some more of the forensic evidence, and that kind of, I think this is a good illustration of how some just smart forensic work and simple smart forensic work can really illustrate kind of bring to life what happened in the context of a crime or in the commission of a crime. So here we have, talk us through what we have here, Gerard, because this is
so what you're looking at now.
She hung a picture
this is from
on
the
the
ballistics.
Wall. This is the picture off the wall, yes?
Yeah. So this is Captain Johan van Rooyen, who was from the ballistics lab in Pretoria. I think he's left the police since then, if I'm not mistaken. So this is his afterwards reconstruction from a ballistic point of view. So you'll see all those little black marks on the wall, except for the little stickers which have arrows, are pellets. Now, if you look at the right-hand photograph, you can see literally in the middle of those pellets is what they call a void, which essentially that's, of course, where Jacques' head would have been. So the pellets are fired. Obviously, a shotgun doesn't, depending on the length of the barrel and what kind of shot shell you've got, it'll influence how much it spreads. So that also helps the police determine how far away the person was, how far the shot spread, etc. So there you can see this person reconstructing, Jacques' head was there and the pellets missed him and hit the wall. And of course, the main chunk of that load of pellets went straight into the back right-hand side of his head. And they actually said he was probably kind of leaning down, almost like he's at his computer with his headphones on, and looking down at the screen or looking down, because the shot was at a little bit of an upwards angle, which was likely because he was bending slightly forward, but also the direction of the shot coming from that passage. Now, again, if she hadn't confessed, people would have been trying to reconstruct this and going, but now, how come he was shot from the passage when the door was on the other side? The door would have been to Jacques' left around the corner that you saw him Mariska was trying to get him out of the front door, and the passage is to his right. So later on, if Mariska hadn't actually confessed, they could have started to say, but how is it the burglars are shooting from down the passage when they would have had to come to the front door, go down? It just doesn't make sense, specifically with Mariska saying, Jacques screamed, lock yourselves away. But now he's standing facing the computer. Now, if you've got burglars in your house, are you going to be standing facing your computer and the shot's coming from down the passage almost, or that direction? That probably would have been very crucial if she hadn't. And so this is where the ballistics, it wasn't really relevant for the trial, but you never know that. You know what I'm saying? You don't know at the time of the crime scene what's going to happen, what the defense is going to be. So again, and Van Rooyen basically said he was in front of the desk. The muzzle of the firearm was about 30 to 60 centimeters away from his head. And this is kind of later what she confessed and admitted to. So there, Van Rooyen's reconstruction was confirmed by actually Mariska's later later confession, etc. So of course, I did find in the docket, there was a gunshot residue test on a left and a right hand, and there was negative, but I can't find on the actual report whose hands were they. Was that Jacques, wanting to rule out suicide, or I don't know, or was it Mariska's hands? So we don't actually know. I don't know, whose actual gunshot residue test. I'm sure in the docket they would have indicated whose it was, but not on the actual form, the report from SAPS. But again, gunshot residue with enough washing can be washed off. So it's not a guarantee that you'll always have gunshot residue, even in someone that did fire off a gun fairly recently. The autopsy, just jumping to that, obviously gunshot wound to the back of the head. The doctor did notice that Jacques, the deceased, had contusions on his arms and bite marks on his lower left, on his wrist, 2 bite marks. On his right wrist and his lower left arm, there were bite marks. So this fight was quite a vicious one, literally hand and tooth, as they might say in the expression. And that was really from a forensics point of view. But again, if you treat it as a home invasion, you treat it as a suicide, you're not going to call the necessary experts out to later help you refute or confirm whatever the later version that you might suspect.
Okay. All right. So I think we've covered the actual incident itself pretty thoroughly, and had a look at some of the very interesting forensic work that was done and what have you. So we go to trial.
Yeah.
The state.
So this was
Mariska du Plessis.
So the incident was 2017. I think it was 2019 when it was on trial. It might have started in 2018. I got involved 2019, so just before COVID. And essentially, as I said, the state, she admitted to shooting, but her defense was kind of weird. So she admitted to shooting him, but they were going to kind of go for a battered woman type of defense, which actually isn't a defense, but anyway. So there was no dispute at trial that she was the one that pulled the trigger. It was more kind of I suppose you could say justification, how much of a blameworthiness, is there enough of an excuse to get her off, or maybe to at least be taken account when it came to sentencing. And that's where the defense called her psychologist, who had been treating her since, I think, 2015. He'd seen her a couple times in the sort of years leading up to that. In fact, it came out during cross-examination that his last session with her was the day before the actual shooting. And he never mentioned that. That only came out during cross-examination. And the judge was quite sort of upset about why that was the case, that he didn't bring that forth himself. And essentially, he wrote a very brief report saying, oh, this is battered woman syndrome, and that probably all contributed to the pulling of the trigger on that night. And that's where he made a cardinal mistake. If you are someone's therapist, psychologist, psychotherapist, you can never play a forensic role. You can never give your opinion about the case, the facts of the case, because then you are squarely stepping into the role of a forensic capacity as opposed to a therapeutic capacity. So that's automatically, by that, you've already committed an ethical violation at the Health Professions Council. And it's a lot of reasons why psychologists are found guilty of just that very thing. And obviously, that's when the psychologist called me and said, wait, we're not going to cross-examine this person. I need to get my expert. And they postponed for the purposes of getting me in to advise on the cross-examination, but also requesting that I conduct an assessment of Mariska. And that's how it is that I came about doing that literal visual reconstruction at the actual house and the interviews. And I interviewed about, I think, 10 family, friends, co-workers, neighbors, and of course Mariska, and did the walkthrough at the house.
Okay, so Pierre has asked, in domestic violence cases, what is the psychological motivation to do that? The reason I brought this up is because let's talk a little bit broadly about some of the psychological concepts that you brought up. For example, battered women syndrome. Let's unpack that a little bit. But Mariska had a number of there were other issues that came up in the course of the trial: borderline personality disorder, bipolar mood disorder. She had some eating disorders. And then we talk about intimate partner violence, battered women syndrome. Where can we start here with some of these kind of issues that are playing around both with Mariska and Jacques, and obviously that kind of are rearing their ugly heads in the committing of the crime?
So you mentioned those various diagnoses that were made by other people. I think I kind of confirmed them in my report. In other words, I agreed with what the previous findings were diagnostically. But things like bipolar mood disorder, it means you probably had 1 or 2 depressive episodes and you've had at least 1 manic episode, which is the opposite. That's where the bipolar. Doesn't mean you're cycling rapidly every day or week between them. That in itself is not going to be relevant for your trial, really. It's not going to rob you of the capacity to be held accountable unless you were in a manic phase and you did something in the manic phase, maybe.
Okay.
The borderline personality disorder, again, that doesn't affect your ability to determine right from wrong. Kind of means you're going to have very stormy emotional relationships, which I think what we saw displayed in just some of those video clips is kind of part of that borderline personality disorder. It's very, very difficult to be in a relationship with a borderline personality person. They interpret anything as rejection. So it's kind of like this love-hate, like the worst teenager girl that you ever come across, when they're moody and 1 minute is like this, the next minute is like that, times 10 is kind of like, the sort of stereotypical borderline personality disorder.
I think that's all teenagers, actually, Gerard. I think it's all teenagers.
So that wouldn't really, those wouldn't be defenses. There wouldn't be reasons why you're going to be found not guilty, but they're not helping in the situation in terms of your relationship. So they probably contributed to what happened on that evening, but they're not excuses in the eyes of the law. But the battered woman syndrome, which is not a diagnosis, it's not in our diagnostic manual, the DSM-5 or the ICD 10, 12, 11. So it's kind of a syndrome. It's not really well defined, is hotly disputed. Essentially, in a nutshell, means that women who are in a sort of abusive domestic relationship almost develop this sort of learned helplessness, where they kind of learn to avoid triggering any fights. They learn how to be helpless. They kind of learn to be almost like how to become the best prisoner you can, that you don't get attention by the prison guards. You know what I mean? And you kind of whittle away till you kind of this shell of yourself in an effort to try and prevent violence from happening.
So the key issue is that this is this helplessness. So that's why when you talk about someone picking up a gun and shooting someone, that's not helpless. That's not helplessness. So it's not really an explanation for why someone picks up a gun and shoots someone. So that's why it's not really going to be usable in this case as a defense, where it might be more likely to have success. Probably not going to get you off, but definitely would be taken for mitigation. Is, let's say you're this battered woman syndrome person, you can't stand up for yourself, you're always just trying to avoid conflict, and your husband is beating your children or sexually molesting your daughter, and eventually that comes out and you both get arrested and you're both charged, you might be able to use something a battered woman syndrome to say, but I was too afraid to do anything. This guy was violent towards me. Battered woman syndrome is present, and hence I didn't act. So it's more about I didn't do something. Whereas picking up a gun and shooting someone is kind of like the antithesis of battered woman syndrome. You're no longer this helpless defenseless person who cannot act. So that's why, I mean, even in the legal world across the world, it's really more something that you might really want to introduce for mitigation. It's not going to get you out of like killing someone. So it was really the faulty legal premises. And her advocate actually said, we're going to make this a test case for battered woman syndrome. And of course, it was anything but that. To the point where after we finished cross-examining the psychologist, and I was helping the prosecutor sitting right next to her, so this guy, was not going to have an easy time because he was talking a load of bullshit. And literally he lied about things. He made things up. He said, that Jacques, the deceased, was a rapist. He said that Jacques was a narcissist. And when we called him to say, but where do you get this from? There was never a rape case opened up by her or anybody else. Nothing in your notes do you reflect rape. Nothing in your notes do you even reflect battered woman syndrome or domestic violence. And nowhere in your notes do you reflect narcissism. And you never even assessed him. He came once when he brought his son for therapy. And I think there was one sort of family session, and he declined to have any individual therapy. So that was another ethical transgression, is where he diagnosed someone that he did not actually assess and did not have consent to assess. And anyway, even if you'd seen this person as part of the son's therapy, even though the fact that he's dead doesn't mean you can break any confidentiality anyway. So he really got nailed and had to concede a whole bunch of things. And the judge was highly unimpressed with his notes, which literally I've never seen such shocking notes. We subpoenaed all of his notes from the sessions with Mariska. And like literally sometimes it was a scratchy, half-completed sentence. And we said, but these are not proper clinical notes. He said, no, he remembers all these things. It's like, hang on a minute. But if you're seeing 40 patients a week, and this is now 5 years ago, imagine how many sessions that are. How can you remember all of this? So the judge lambasted him to the point at the sentencing where the judge says this guy must be reported to the Health Professions Council, and he ultimately was. But the point I want to get back to is after we finished cross-examining, the defense actually said, okay, we want to abandon this battered woman syndrome defense, and we want to make admissions that she killed Jacques and she had no legal defense to do so. So literally after that vigorous cross-examination, and I've never had that before, they literally wanted to change their guilty plea. And the prosecutors insisted that she still wants to reopen her case. She still wants to call me and had to have me give my evidence also.
Is there no liability held by the actual defense team for putting this person on the stand? I mean, do the judge, do they not carry any of the responsibility? Because I assume that they know what this person is going to bring to the table.
They would probably say is, he's the expert, not us.
Okay.
That's why we hire an expert to come and say stuff. I mean, if it
enough.
sounds nonsense to me, what am I supposed to say? As long as I know the guy isn't being unethical, obviously unethical and changing and lying, how am I supposed to say? And, and if this guy's saying what they want to hear, which this guy was, they're definitely going to call him. And again, this is my problem sometimes, is that this was a very good prosecutor who was very senior, who knew me and phoned me and said, can you help? And got authorization for funding to pay for me to be an expert witness. In a lower court with a lesser experienced prosecutor, or in the magistrate's court, this prosecutor might have just accepted this person's evidence, and then we might have had a very, very, very different outcome. I don't think we would have had a not guilty verdict, but I think we might have had, an even lesser strict sentence if it hadn't been an experience. That's why I get very upset with psychologists who step into the forensic world and don't know what they're doing, or intentionally, and I'm not saying this guy did, or intentionally lie to make up nonsense. I mean, I have no time for you, and I've got no sympathy for you. If you're going to get your ass kicked in court, it's unfortunately your day. You should have known better.
You know, if you're in the psychology field, is there a lecture at varsity that covers this stuff? You know, is there a threshold you have to cross in order to be able to give testimony at a trial?
Okay. So no, there's no requirements. There's no formal requirements of when you can and cannot give evidence. There are general ethics, lectures, and I think you're right. Your board exam at the psychology board before you register has a big chunk on ethics, but that's probably not going to be the court stuff, and that's a big gap. We don't properly teach psychologists, even those who don't want to get involved in court work. We should be telling them what you can and cannot say. If you're the therapist, you have to stick literally to your notes. You can't comment on the case. And you're not actually there as an expert witness, although you're a psychologist. You're there as a factual witness. And that if you get asked this question, you should say, but that's a forensic question. I cannot answer that. And some psychologists think they have this client-patient confidentiality, which does not exist in our courts for psychologists. In fact, for almost nobody is this legal privilege. I mean, there are some for, like, obviously lawyers and spouses, but psychologists don't have this, I have an oath of confidentiality to my patient, don't exist. So I've had psychologists say to me, well, I'm going to refuse to respond to a subpoena. Well, you're just going to get arrested and get your ass dragged into court. And I think there's a big gap that we don't teach some of the basic things to psychologists, even those who have no plans to get involved in forensic work. So you don't do something stupid like this and get yourself in the world of trouble. Because eventually he was convicted at the HPCSA, the Health Professions Council, the psychologist. He got like a year of supervision under another psychologist. He wasn't scrapped from the role, and I think he had to pay 20,000 Rand fine. That was ultimately his punishment.
Well, he learned his lesson to some degree. You hope then he learned his lesson.
So.
You hope he learned his lesson.
I hope so.
Exactly. At least there's there is some comeuppance for his behavior. I was just scrolling through see if there's looking at some questions here. Let's have a little look through the chat. Okay. I think she was so desensitized. This is Henry. I'm just going to bring up this question. I think she was so desensitized from the constant fighting that the shooting was the next step. Now, you talked about the battered woman syndrome. Now, a woman who's experienced a lot of violence will suffer trauma. Is there a condition as a result of kind of post-traumatic?
Yeah. Look, I mean, obviously anybody who experiences something traumatic, whether it's breaking your leg, falling off a ladder, or a car accident, or violence, as a potential. Not everybody will develop PTSD. Almost understandably, you're going to have anxiety and trauma symptoms, but those often dissipate over a week or two, which is why you don't diagnose PTSD from day one. It has to be a period of time before you can actually make the diagnosis. So, of course, these fights would have had trauma impact on her, and of course would have had a trauma impact on him. It might be different degrees of that. And this is where these types of things, as in this case, became relevant at sentencing. And as when we get to the sentence, she wasn't given the stiffest of sentence, and probably because of the domestic violence, etc., that took place on that particular evening at least.
Yeah. Well, unless there is anything else you wanted to highlight from the actual court case itself, I mean, maybe we can jump ahead or we can just jump to the sentencing.
Yeah, just in terms of my evidence that I testified, I said there was no temporary insanity, to use that term, non-pathological criminal capacity. That I even said to her, when you fired the shot, did you accidentally bump your arm against the doorway and the gun went off? I was trying to determine it was accidental. And she said, no, she cocked the gun and she pulled the trigger intentionally. So I said that kind of ruled out any temporary insanity kind of argument. I said there was no battered woman syndrome. Yes, there was domestic violence, absolutely. but there was no battered woman syndrome. It's not at play here. She can be held fully accountable and held responsible for her behavior. And that, in a nutshell, was my evidence. And yeah, I mean, the judge, obviously, once they themselves withdrawn the battered woman defense, was and admitted that they had no legal defense for her shooting, that essentially she's really changed her plea to one of guilty. So it was no brainer. The judge then obviously found her guilty. And then, of course, we went over into the sentencing phase, where I think she called 2 psychologists to come and testify at sentencing. And then we had the actual sentence given by the judge.
How long did you actually testify for? How long does that session take? Is it a day?
Oh, my personal testimony was, I think, probably done and dusted on the same day. I might have come back the next day for cross-examination. Often they'll just postpone so they can kind of gather their wits about them. So I typically, my experience is that I'm going to be, if I'm the first witness on the day, I'll usually be done and cross-examined, because we've made my report available for and to the other side so they can prepare. And that's just the best way that you get done and dusted. Otherwise, sometimes you get postponed to 6 months and you have to come back 6 months later to be cross-examined. And that's never fun for the person being cross-examined, because it's just long after what you said. And, whereas if it's today or the next day, it's all fresh in your mind. And you say, no, I didn't say that. What I said was 1, 2, and 3. Yeah.
Do you remember the first case you testified in, Gerard?
I do. My very first case was actually covered in a documentary many years ago of a wife with her daughter and the daughter's boyfriend conspired to kill the paraplegic husband and try and make it look like a farm attack. Long story short, the wife was eventually prosecuted and got a life sentence. The boyfriend who pulled the trigger, I think he got 15 years, because they often go after the main instigator and see them as more culpable or responsible. That's why the wife got she was the coordinator of the whole event. She got the life. I think he got 15 years, and they didn't prosecute the daughter of the deceased. So that was the very first time, and that was like about 6 days in the witness stand being cross-examined. I've never had. It was a baptism by fire. So anything that came afterwards. It also led to, they had a psychologist who I criticized in my report, rightly so, who reported me to the Health Professions Council. Ultimately, there was a hearing, and the case was dismissed against me for criticizing him, because, I mean, in a courtroom, to criticize scientifically the other expert, I mean, that happens all the time. You're not standing on a street corner slagging someone off. It's in a courtroom, giving your scientific reasons why this evidence of the other person is not good evidence. So it is even bizarre that they even went to a hearing, but it went to a hearing. It was eventually, the charge was withdrawn against me. So that was a baptism by fire for so many reasons. And that was back in 2001.
Okay. When you reflect back on your career as, giving testimony in cases over the years, I mean, it must be rewarding. I imagine it's
I love testifying. A lot of people are scared of it. You should always be anxious, because that anxiety makes you do a better job and double check what you're doing. But I find it a wonderful test of your knowledge. And you've been very helpful. If you've been honest, of course, you've been helpful to a court, helping them understand something that they might not have understood. So I find it very rewarding. So I love testifying. I think I've testified now about 130 times in managed courts, high courts in South Africa, and I thoroughly enjoy it. I mean, I've had a couple unpleasant experiences due to asshole lawyers, no other way to put it. But I find that was more in my earlier years. I think as I've gotten more experienced and more senior, I don't find lawyers doing the cheap personal attacks anymore. So again, that might just be experience, time, reputation, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. No, man, nobody's willing to, if you're going to, you've got lots of experience. You got to have the weaponry you got to bring it if they're going to challenge you by this stage of your career on your testimony. Also, it's kind of the front line of your profession. So I imagine that it's also questioning, challenging, and moving forward kind of aspects of forensic psychology that are and shaping the law in a sense, I guess.
Yeah, and getting good judgments. I mean, our testimony on linkage analysis, linkage evidence in serial cases has become case law. So whenever there are similar
incidences, people refer to those cases, and that's always cool to be part of, case law that's made some history. So yes, it's great. I mean, but it's also about making sure you know what you're doing. Don't go into forensic work just without having had some mentoring, some advice, not at the end when you submit your report, but before you even start your assessment about, is the referral question one that I should be doing? So definitely just, it's money well spent, or if you have a friend that just is happy to supervise you, do it. I did it from day one, and even till today, I'll often send a report to a friend of mine who's a psychologist and say, Bronwyn, will you please look at this and just tell me, am I making sense? Never assume. And that's what I see. Even your very experienced psychologists almost get this attitude about themselves that whatever comes out of my mouth is an expert opinion, and who say things that are just horrifically wrong scientifically. And I've seen the worst work actually been done by people with titles like professor and doctor in front of their name, and who repeatedly do crappy work.
Well, I got an email the other day, somebody offering, all I have to do is do an online course for a couple of weeks, send them a couple of $1,000, and I'll be a doctor in 6 months, I felt.
I got that email too.
All right,
should we
let's jump to the sentence, exactly, and then we'll do because we're over our hour, but we'll take some questions, and we'll look at some questions that we got during the week, and we'll wrap things up for the night. But
not just looking at my iPad.
But not a sentence that I think folks at home are going to be totally. It's one of those ones where it's leaves a bit of a bad taste in the mouth.
3rd of September 2019, she was sentenced as follows. This is reading from the actual court stuff. On count 1, murder, 10 years imprisonment. Count 2, possession of an unlicensed firearm, the shotgun, 4 years. Count 3, possession of ammunition, 1 year imprisonment. And count 4, defeating the administration of justice. That was when she lied about that it was actually burglars. She got 3 years. Of course, these are basically going to run concurrently, so it's not like she's serving 10 plus 4 plus 1 plus 3, and it's 18 years. Effectively, the 10-year sentence is really the one that's determining her length.
Yeah.
Which means after 5, she could be eligible for parole if she's behaved herself, which means, probably last year, she could have been given parole.
Well, I think it's one of those cases that, like we did with the Vredendal murderer, the teenage serial killer, one of those cases that perhaps we can follow up during the week and see if we can find out what the current status is as well. I mean, this does come up fairly regularly, but again, for kind of new viewers, I'm going to pop a question up here that Nalene, we've discussed it plenty of times on the podcast, but it is interesting because, I think a lot of people are influenced by kind of American and British media. But this is the question. Why do we not have real life sentences in South Africa? What is the reasoning behind the 25-year cap? Because hearing that someone like Mariska is getting a 10-year sentence, it is kind of shocking,
Okay, so let's first start with Mariska's sentence. Why did she get 10 years? So the Minimum Sentences Act, I think, for a first-time non-premeditated murder, I think is 15 years. So the court can deviate down or upwards with a good motivation. I think in this particular instance, because there was that domestic violence in the evening as captured on that video, the court knocked off some years. It is a bit on the lower side. Typically, I see for spontaneous intimate partner murders, I see between 12 and 15 years is my personal experience. 10 is on the lower side. And again, as I said, would have been because of that domestic violence on the evening in question. Do I agree with that? That's a separate question. I'm just saying what the court said. Now to come to Nalene's question about life. A lot of people think that life is only 25 years. A lot of prosecutors think that life is only 25 years in South Africa. A life sentence is a life sentence. You die with a life sentence hanging over your head. However, the minimum detention period, is 25 years, which means you will serve 25 years on a life sentence. The judge cannot make that less than 25 years. You will serve 25 years. It's determined by statute, if I'm not mistaken. And from 25 years onwards, every, say, 2 years, you will have a parole hearing. If you don't get parole the first time, you're staying in prison. Maybe by the second or third time,
if your behavior has been good over the 25 years, you've kind of shown that you've rehabilitated, etc., eventually you'll get parole. Might be after 27 years, 29 years, 30 years. You're then released. You're not discharged from your sentence. You're serving the remainder of your sentence in the community with conditions. You know, you're not allowed to drink alcohol. You're not allowed to go out at night. You can only go to work and back and church on a Sunday. You're not allowed to associate with criminals. You're not allowed to, of course, get convicted of anything else. If you break those conditions, you can be pulled right back into prison, and you'll have to then qualify parole at a later date. So the life sentence hangs over your head till the day you die. The question is, after 25 years, where will you be serving it? In custody or out? And I can tell you now, the majority of people on a life sentence do not die in prison unless they have a heart attack. They will probably be given parole, some of them at the first opportunity at 25 years, some of them 2 or 3 parole sessions down the line, but they're probably going to get parole. So it is not that it's limited to 25 years. It just means after 25 years, you might have the opportunity to be on parole. And if you bugger up, you're going to get pulled right back in and continue serving that sentence in prison until you qualify for parole again. That's the short answer.
Okay, and obviously there are kind of other issues that kind of come into this conversation. In that, what we're seeing now is that, you know, like the golden age of serial killers, for example, in South Africa in the 90s, when you know, real attention was turned to policing the entire nation in the aftermath of apartheid, and we realized that there were a lot of serial killers at work. These are guys who were locked up in the 90s and are now hitting that 25-year margin. Just remind us a little bit about how the system manages to keep track of, or doesn't, of what issue, you know, what psychological conditions these folks have, who are coming up, you know, and becoming liable to possibly be paroled and released.
Yeah, so I mean, essentially, this is one of my frustrations, is that it's not like a copy of the court case or the type judgment or the type sentence goes along with the person to prison. It's not like a copy of that person's docket, police docket, goes along with them to prison. So very often, all the court knows is you being found guilty of 1 times murder, 1 times robbery, your sentence is 10 years for this, 20 years for that. That's all they know about you, specifically if it wasn't a high-profile case. So there's a very good chance that if you've been a good boy in prison, you haven't really gotten into any trouble, you've attended whatever arbitrary programs there are for rehabilitation, I'm trying to do my inverted commas, rehabilitation, and you've just kept your nose clean, there's a damn good chance, no matter what you've done, that you're going to get given parole. Our parole system needs to be massively revised. How we sentence people, this fact that if you convict a serial rapist who's raped 5 women, you convict them for all 5 women in one trial, all of those sentences start ticking down simultaneous on day 1. So you're really only serving, if you've got 15 years, 15 years, 15 years, 15 years, 15 years for all of those rape victims, you're only going to sit in, the maximum you're going to sit in jail is 15 years. And that's if you don't get parole halfway through that sentence. Yeah. So you're really effectively being punished once, not 15 times. Yeah. So these guys do have the possibility of coming out on parole. Like I said, if you kept your nose clean, there's a damn good chance they're going to give it to you no matter who you are and what you've done. If they think, but you've been a good boy, so you deserve the opportunity to be released back into society. Yeah. Unfortunately, the other side of that is the opportunity to kill someone.
And there's not a mechanism to ensure you know, it's not required that the public is made aware of this, you know. Somebody mentioned, we had JC say, hi, will you guys cover the case of Buti Boo, for example? I mean, there's a prime example of somebody who has served 25 years by now. I think he's done full 25 years, is it?
Well, remember, sorry to jump in there, Paul. Yeah. If you were convicted of life before, I think, 2004, your minimum detention period was 20 years, not 25.
Wow, okay.
On a life sentence.
And here we have cannibalism, you know, with Buti Boo, you have cannibalism, necrophilia, you know, murdering women, children, his own children. I mean, kind of a case study in just about everything that could go wrong with a person to make them a dangerous individual. And this is somebody who, yes, well, there have been documentaries about him, and it's thankfully there's more of a public awareness of somebody like Stuart Vilken. But the system is the system, and it's feasible that he could be released back into the public, for example.
And he's not even the biggest thing we have to worry about. I mean, how many serial murderers are there compared to the average criminals in jail?
Yeah.
We have to worry about every day there's guys coming out who either went through an ineffective parole hearing, like my personal experiences are with parole boards, who ignore the reports by psychologists who say this guy's a danger. Well, that's just your opinion, and you're one of 10 people.
Yeah.
We worry about the big high-profile cases we hear about. Every day, probably thousands of people are being released from prison who are dangerous.
Fairly antisocial, yeah. And also, I mean, we've come across cases of folks who have just disappeared out of prison altogether, and the correctional services, the prosecuting authority, nobody can tell you where they are. So a lot. Anyway, it does give us a lot of fodder for discussion on the podcast. After interviewing her and getting an idea of her personality, do you think she would have done something like this in the same situation, but without being intoxicated? That's from Gaming with a Glitch.
Yeah, and I think in my report, one of my final findings was that, I mean, if we hadn't had that fight on that night, I don't think we would have had the murder. I'm trying to actually quickly call up my report here on my iPad. I mean, you got to be fair if you're doing these things.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to see what point it was.
No worries. Helen says, gosh, we really need a registry. Yes, that's something we can maybe mention as well. Is there a record kept of, in other countries you'll hear about kind of sex offender registries, etc. We can maybe talk a little bit about, just reference that as well, Gerard. Have you found what you were looking for there?
I don't want to spend too much time on it, but basically I did say that if there was the fight and the drinking that had been taking place that night, we wouldn't have had that murder that night. Was it in the cards to happen at a later point? I don't know. I mean, I can't predict the future. So I think that was definitely one of my opinions, that if that night she hadn't sat down and planned, there's no indication she thought, I want to kill Jacques, and this happened to be the night to do it. So, which is also why she wasn't found guilty of premeditated murder and given a life sentence.
For sure. All right. A registry of some sort. I mean, is that ever something that's come up in your experience, I've never heard any call for one in South Africa. I don't know if,
Well, look, there's the registry for people convicted of child sexual offences.
Okay.
That you get added to that registry as part of the findings of sentencing or judgment, that you will be added to the list of people. The thing is, it is not a publicly accessible list. It's only accessible to like employers, like schools, if they want to double check this person is not on that list. So it's a very, very, we can't just go Google and look it up. Like in the States, in some places, it is a publicly accessible list, so you can see if there's a pedophile staying down the corner. And I hear people's arguments to say, but it should be publicly accessible so we can know who these people are. Yes, but imagine the amount of vigilantism we would have towards these people. And I think that's the concern, is that the society wouldn't allow these people to live a peaceful life. Now, they have to live a law-abiding life, don't get me wrong, but if they are law-abiding and they're keeping their noses clean and they've done whatever sentence they've got, or they've been given parole, I know I'm not going to be popular for saying this, we shouldn't then target and hound them out. I mean, they can never find a place to work. They can never find a place to stay. So I hear the arguments from both sides, but I think unfortunately in our society, what do you think is going to happen to those people? We'd have people literally going out and killing them vigilante style. That's what's going to happen.
Exactly. So, yeah, I mean, there are so many directions that kind of the justice system that we need to look at and point at that needs some kind of extra consideration and thought in order for us to curb some of the, the crazy crime statistics that we have here in South Africa. Okay, so let's wrap up the Mariska case, Gerard. 10 years is pretty shocking. We will follow up and see if we can find out what the status is of potential parole, etc. We'll do that for next week. And also just to point out that tomorrow evening at 8 o'clock, we're going to premiere a new episode of True Crime Room with Derek Reedley, and he is covering this case as well. So you'll get to meet some of the family members of those involved and really get a sense of how they felt, as this tragic incident unfolded, and how they feel in the aftermath of it, how they felt about the sentence, for example. So just check that out tomorrow night, 8 o'clock on the channel, premiering, and then it'll be available for you to stream after that. Your key takeaway from this case, Gerard?
Look, I mean, obviously at the end of it, remember there was that little boy whose mom went away to prison. It seemed like, Jacques' family were quite keen to look after him. It sounded like he had, how can I put it, basically been kind of like turned against his uncle and the grandma, and was not quite antagonistic towards them. So I don't know where he was in the time that Mariska was in jail, and I really just hope this little kid's doing okay. That would be, I just hope he's managed to get, just now, he must be now 20-ish. And I really hope he's managed to find some peace and direction in his life and is able to live just a good, healthy life. Just because your parents did something doesn't mean that you have to follow in those footsteps. So I just think about that kid,
Yeah, you must remember, in these family incidents, the victims who are family members, they lose so much in the blink of an eye, don't they? I mean, it's essentially losing both parents.
And I mean, we often don't want to think of the offender, but, as I said, these people do come back into society.
Yeah.
Do I think she's a risk of killing future partners? I think it's very unlikely, So I hope for her own sake that, she's done her time, the maximum. We hit the 10-year mark. So she, as I said, she might have been paroled 5 years ago. So I hope also she's got some peace and her life has got stability and she's able to just move on with it and be a productive member of society and the best mom she can be for her son.
Yeah.
Still his mom.
Absolutely. Okay, so we'll see what feedback we can give you on the case next week as well. And check out our social media pages throughout the week. If anything particularly interesting comes up, we will post about it in the course of the week. We had some questions during the week, Gerard. Maybe we can just do one or two of them quickly.
Yeah.
Does South Africa make use of body behavior analysts when interrogations are taking place? And do we record interrogations in South Africa at all?
So we don't have body language, if you want to call it that, experts. It's a science that's kind of very fraught with how much of it is science and how much of it is kind of made up stuff that has no scientific backing. So no. So I'm sure every cop, as we all do, when we're interviewing and speaking to someone, we're looking at body language. We never, even if we don't realize it, we're assessing body language. But no, we don't have experts in the cops to do that. I don't even know really overseas if they have that so much. Do you record interviews? It's not part of police procedure. I think there's some practical issues. I think coming from the old police days, they didn't want interrogations recorded. So there's not a culture of doing that in South Africa. It's not a requirement by law. And also you have to factor into now you'd have to have video recording facilities, or each detective would have to be issued with a recording device. It's got its expenses associated with it. They get lost, they get broken, they won't get fixed. So here and there, like Cape Town Serious Violent Crime Unit in the very old days had a proper interview room with cameras, on a glass table, so you couldn't be pointing a gun at the suspect underneath the table. That's like one of the few places that I've ever heard. I used to personally record at least audio-wise and sometimes video-wise. And that is my own personal devices, my own expense, my own interest, my interviews. Just that I have a backup. If the guy says, I never told him that, I can say, well, I've got the recording, but also just to improve my own skills. And of course, we did a lot of training, so I might use those for training. In fact, still to this day, I use some of those snippets of those interviews. You heard the Jose de Silva episode that we've got on our podcast.
Yeah.
And I mean, that audio you hear there was my first interview of a suspect, and I recorded that with my own sort of equipment. But that was my own interest. I didn't have anxiety about recording stuff and having someone else maybe listen to it one day if necessary.
Yeah, which means that we don't have as much. I mean, the fact that there's not cameras in every interrogation room, I mean, it really is one of the main veins you'll see in true crime content, specifically
Yeah.
in particular American and British content, where you'll see a lot of that interrogation room. And unfortunately, when we're making this kind of content in South Africa, we don't have a lot of access.
Yeah.
That said,
So I think if I could change one or two, I'd change a lot of things in the police, but one of them would be body cams for all uniformed policemen. That's a game changer. In policing, policemen improving their behavior, but also evidence of suspects' behaviors. That's absolutely essential to improving the quality of our police. And imagine if every cop had a body cam. How could you bribe someone? And you can't go and erase that. The stuff is done in a very certain way that it's activated and it's on, and you can't download, erase the footage, etc. That and the recording of interviews with people, very important.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I think we should wrap things up now, Gerard. I mean, we've got lots of great episodes planned for the year ahead. We're now into 2025. We're busy doing our kind of planning and thinking about what kinds of episodes we can do for folks at home. We'll maybe go over some cases. Well, I mean, if you want to go back, we were talking a lot about Parole. If you want to go back and listen, we did an episode. I think it's titled "Get Out of Jail," the "Get Out of Jail" card, or the "Get Out of Jail Free" card. So go back and we have a long discussion on that subject on that episode. But do go back and listen to some of the previous episodes if you're new to the channel. There's lots and lots of interesting nuances and unique aspects to South African crime and to what Gerard did for a large portion of his career. So always interesting to go back and check out some of those previous episodes. Serial killer cases, we obviously cover a lot of. Where are all the serial killers, Gerard? Because I feel like I haven't picked up the newspaper and there's been like a fuss about somebody in East London or Port Elizabeth or Pretoria.
I mean, the last big case we had was, I guess, Sifiso Nkwazi, the guy who killed the sex workers in Johannesburg. Yeah. But, I'm sure there's investigations going on that we just don't hear about for sometimes very good reasons. But yeah, even in the media, I can't think when last I heard about a serial murderer active or at court.
I think we're going to have to put that on our to-do list as well to find out what cases are potentially kind of ongoing as well. We also get a number of suggestions about cold cases that have gone unsolved, family members, and we do take a look at those, and where we think we can cover a topic, we will it will go into the mix for a discussion, and if it's something that we can talk about, then we will. All right, Gerard. Well, thank you very much again. It's been wonderful. Thank you to everyone for watching along on the live chat.
Thanks, everybody.
It's always great to hang out with you on a Tuesday. Next week, a couple of surprises for you guys. So do join us next week. We're hoping to have a guest or two on the show. So we'll be back next week, Tuesday. My final reminder about Derek Reedley covering this case, the case of the murder of Jacques du Plessis by his wife, Mariska du Plessis, on True Crime Room, premiering tomorrow at 8 p.m. and then available to stream on YouTube. Thank you, Gerard. So it's been great.
Thanks, everybody, for watching. So we got up to about 86 viewers, if I'm not mistaken, which I think is significantly more than we normally have.
Yeah, I mean, let's hope that week in, week out, we're going to just kind of grow and grow and grow. That's the plan, isn't it? And it helps if you hit the like button, if you subscribe to the channel. That really, really makes a massive difference. And it helps us to do some, we do this out of the love of you, for the love of you guys and the love of telling these stories. And also because we think that there's a lot of need in South Africa to discuss a lot of these issues and to create a greater understanding among South Africans around what some of the challenges are that we really confront every day, because we have some big ones. A special thank you to Amy, Bax, and Fred for their continued support behind the scenes. Oh, I just wanted to mention, if you can also become a member of the channel. I know that we weren't posting as much stuff as we could in the last couple of weeks, but we're back up and running now. I know Amy's been cutting together some of the interviews that we've recorded over the last couple of years, and we will be bringing you more content in that space as well. So please do become a member on the channel. your contributions will really help us to be able to do more and more. I'm Paul Llewellyn. Gerard, thank you very much. We'll see you again next week.
Cheers,
Until next time, everybody, just keep looking over your shoulder, eh? Yeah.
I am a human being and I killed human beings.
Before I knew it, I'd fired 4 shots at the door. I kept on shouting for Eva to phone the police.
Tests are underway to determine if a serial killer is on the loose in Centurion, Pretoria.
The dead won't bother you. It's the living you gotta worry about.